Welcome back to the show. My guest today is Faisal Susiwala, recently named as the #1 REMAX agent worldwide in terms of sales volume and number of homes sold as well. He's also the author of the book, The Real Deal, Billion-Dollar Real Estate Broker. Listeners, if you'd like a chance to chat with Faisal yourself, start by going to homeshack.com. You can also call Faisal directly, 519-624-5555, or through email, faisal@homeshack.com. So, Faisal, before the break, we quickly mentioned that there's some big news on the way for both renters and landlords here in Ontario. What's coming down the pipe?
So we've seen, let's go back to what happens when you don't pay your mortgage payment. What happens when you're not paying on a loan that you've borrowed? You get reported to the credit agency. And now any future lender will know what your ability was to pay and what your habits are. So basically, that is something that did not exist between landlords and tenants. So there has been a lot of lobbying and initiatives to bring greater transparency and accountability to the rental market. So we have a crisis on one hand where there isn't enough affordable housing, there isn't enough housing. Landlords are struggling to get delinquent tenants out of their property. The LTB is taking 11 months to have a hearing. So all of this is discouraging any landlord from entering the market, any investor from buying properties to create. So this is a tool in which the plan is to share landlord and tenant board orders with credit agencies for tenants who have missed payments. So
All right.
this is not when you miss your first payment, you get reported. It's when it's gone through the process and you found to be delinquent that this will be something that will now get reported on your credit so that landlords can make an informed decision whether or not to rent to you moving forward. And it puts a little bit of responsibility on tenants to now make sure they don't take the fact that their rent is due for granted and say, well, I won't get to it now. I'll get to it in a couple of weeks, or I'll let the landlord paper me for a couple of months before I start making payments, or I definitely just won't make payments and wait for my hearing, which is 11 months, and I'll freeload until then. Then I know I come across being hard on tenants, but we have had, and I'm not speaking about all tenants, but we have had our fair share in this region of tenants who have learned to play the system, who
Mhm.
have learned to circumvent the system and get away with it because at the end of the day, the landlord throws up his or her hands and says, it's not worth my time. It's not worth the energy. It's not worth the frustration for me to go after them. We have taken a stronger role on that. And regardless of what the situation is, our property management team will see it right through to the end. We'll
Yeah.
make sure that wages are garnished if they're not paid. And look, I understand I'm sympathetic towards high cost of living and what we have, but if I don't pay my mortgage payment, my bank is not that sympathetic towards me. They don't give me 11 months. They're after me. They're locking my door at 90 days. And I see that sadly with many of my clients that are suffering because of these situations. There is no relief for them. Yet tenants have so many greater rights, and I'm going to take a lot of heat for saying this, and I get killed on social media when I make these comments, but it's the truth. And the truth is, stop playing the system, stop circumventing, be honest about it, be transparent about it. If you have a problem, talk to your landlord. Don't dodge it and think you're going to get away with it because they're not going to come after you. Well, here's one other layer of accountability and transparency so that future landlords don't have the same experience as your past landlord. And sadly, one of the other truths is when I call for a reference check, and this is where you have to be very careful when you're
Mhm.
renting to someone. When I call for a reference check to say, is this tenant a good tenant? Did they pay on time? If that landlord was unhappy with that tenant, they're giving me raving reviews and
Right.
saying this is
Right.
the best tenant ever. They pay 3 days before the rent is even due because they're just so happy to get rid of these people. So we're sort of tarnished now. We can't take someone on their word.
Yeah.
So this format of accountability and reporting, it doesn't lie. It tells us the truth.
And you know, you look at it this way: the landlord is taking, they're the risk taker. They're taking the risk of renting out a property to an individual. Now, with something like this, the individual is taking a risk if they don't pay, if they let it slip, because you know, trying to rebuild your credit, that's a steep hill to climb. So you're right. It's like you said, there'll be those people out there that have got the negative things to say, but you're looking at this from a quarter century of experience, you know, and it leaves a bad taste in your mouth sometimes. And I think that this is just, as you said, it's one more layer of accountability. So it's good that we've got that there. When we take a look, this idea of and you mentioned it too, that idea of just not enough to go around, right? We look at that the stat that you had sent over, that you know, over half of Canadian households, if it's earning less than 60,000 a year, their reliance on charities for the essentials like food and shelter and healthcare have just shot up in the last, say, 5 or 6 years. What did you find out? I know you talked a little bit about in the pre-show notes about what Canada Helps is up to.
Yeah, Canada Helps is an organization that has a mandate to help those Canadians that are, you know, earning less than $60,000 a year. The stats are just staggering when you look at how much reliance there is on food banks, shelters, even for healthcare, and the charities, unfortunately, are not getting enough support right now because of the times that we are in. And the hardest hit are Canadians aged 35 to 54 and families with children. These are the families that are suffering the most right now and earning the least, unfortunately. And they're cutting back on, you know, almost necessities like groceries, like just basic needs that they have. They're cutting back. So CanadaHelps.org is a institution that can help these individuals. People can turn to this organization to get support from the community and just try to get the help where it's needed. And many Canadians are embarrassed to go to the food bank. Many Canadians are embarrassed to ask for help openly. So this is one other opportunity for people to be able to give to an organization and certainly have that organization help them, you know, get out of that little rut that they're in at the moment.
Thanks for bringing that up, Faisal. So CanadaHelps.org, that's where you want to go. You can lend a hand and you can lend some support as well too. Before we wrap up this section, another interesting story that came out of the pre-show notes: the idea of whether or not high-speed rail is the answer to affordable housing. And you might be scratching your head, but Faisal's going to make the connection for us. What do we know, Faisal?
Okay, so what we know is that people cannot afford to live in the city centers,
Right.
Toronto being the biggest city center that we're familiar with. And the high-speed rail idea, one connecting from Windsor to, say, Ottawa and in between, can be really the answer because there are, you know, hundreds of thousands of people that rely on transportation to get to work every day, and spending that extra 4 hours a day on the highway, it's prohibitive, and it causes them not to be able to sustain their employment, having to take you know, massive cuts in other areas just so that they can live a little bit better quality of life. So this whole idea of high-speed rail has been sort of talked about for a long, long time, but really nothing has actually been done about it. But now I think hopefully it's not just a political movement here, but it is something that we see becoming a reality. It could cut commuting times by half for those who are willing to use it. And I know where high-speed rail is on one side. There's something as simple as a GO train. If we look at our region from Cambridge to Union Station, or it makes sense. There's such a high population that is doing it. But really, from Windsor to Toronto would be a great um, opportunity for a
Sure.
high speed train to be uh, running, so that the hour and 15 minutes would be the commute time from
Wow.
Windsor to
Wow.
Toronto. So this is something that I think we're going to see it. It also cuts emissions by 98% over conventional travel.
There you go.
So talk about doing something good for the environment. That's it. Toronto to Montreal, Quebec City, again, that's another option there. And these are all things that are being discussed right now. So our population, half of our country's population is in this region.
Mhm.
And when I'm talking about this region from Ottawa to Windsor. So
Right.
why not have, and we are the only um, country, I believe, in the G7
That's right.
that does not have high speed travel. Like
Right.
that's the problem here. So the cost is significant. It's between 80 to 120 billion dollars, but this is for the federal government to take a hard look at and maybe start spending some of the money in our country where it's needed.
Great point. Great point that you make there at the end. I appreciate that too, Faisal. We'll take a quick break and we'll get an update from the 570 News Center. When we come back, when the numbers don't add up when it comes to housing targets, stay with us here on 570 News Radio.